Hello and welcome to Manibil. As you may have noticed in my series on David Hume's treatise, we have reached, or I have reached, the end of part one, which is the heading of part one is of ideas, their origin, composition, and so on, something like that. Let me get the full. Or of ideas, their origin, composition, connection, abstraction, etc. And since we have, or I have consumed part one now, it might be a good idea to have sort of okay, let me round it up, let me clarify, let me get to some kind of statement on how I see things from Hume's point of view, how I will represent my understanding of where Hume is coming from and present it in a sort of simple and coherent manner in a diagram or whatever it takes that makes sort of rounds it up, so I can always go back for my own sake and have a kind of a notebook, you could say, but in a simplified manner that I can go back to and maybe even drag in to a presentation later if I need to reference something from the earlier part of the book that would be more precisely explained or referenced by using something like this, right? So the next one, part two, will be on the ideas of space and time. So it seems like a good place to do this kind of thing and sort of, resume what we have been doing so far, right? Okay, so my understanding of Hume is that he talks about, and I call it Hume's ontology so far. I'm not necessarily particularly fond of the term ontology because I find it to be too fluffy what is meant by it. Usually it is sort of an idea of what exists, while I am not necessarily saying by doing this kind of philosophy, metaphysics here that Hume is doing, that he's necessarily pointing to existence. He's just describing his experiences, and he might call it mind, or he might call it his perceptions, right? So I'm not particularly fond of the term ontology, but let's just call this structuring a presentation of an ontology, just for the sake of having a term to use, right? That is different from the terms used so far. But it's not a term that Hume uses, so I'm sort of impressing it on Hume, so to say, right? Okay. So he's talking about the human mind as a sort of catch-all phrase for everything that goes on. Then he talks about perceptions. And that should therefore, in my opinion, be understood as a subset of the human mind. There might come, as we have only done the first part of the two books, or the whole treatise, right? So there are many parts to follow, so there might be more stuff being added later, right? So that's why I call it so far. But perceptions, he then divides into two groups that are distinct. There are connections, but they are still distinct. These are impressions and they are ideas. And he says that the impressions are the strong vivacity of quality of sensations, passions, and emotions as they first appear. And then the ideas are, ideas are weak images based on the impressions. You could say it's the weak image of the impression, but it's rather based on the impression, because when you have the idea, the impression might no longer be there, right? So it's sort of based on the impressions. Except, and that's an exception I missed during my deconstruction. He says something like, except those arising from sight and touch. And it seems like there's no other reference to this. So I'm kind of confused about what he actually means by this, except those arising from sight and touch. I don't want. I have to admit I'm blank on that one. I don't understand why sight and touch all of a sudden is set aside, or what he actually means there, right? I might have to dig out the actual quote and maybe take a stab at that in a later part, right? Okay, so these two groupings of perception, which should encompass all perception, but it's a dichotomy of differences of these kinds of perceptions. They can appear as impressions or they can appear as ideas. And there's no in-betweens. There's no beyond. That's what, when you're dealing with perceptions, that's what you have. So he has a sort of analyzed or run through his perceptions and say, there seems to be something that is strong, something that is weak. And they might approach each other in quality or in vivacity or violence, as he called it, but they are not the same. Right? An idea might be very strong and an impression might be quite weak, and they approach each other, but they are still separate, as far as I understand him, right? So there's no reason to think that there's some gray area between impressions and ideas where there's something going on that needn't be philosophized, or a third kind of ontology within perceptions, something like that. He's used sometimes the argument, I don't see no reason to, so therefore I shouldn't go there. So his arguments are not completely watertight always, right? And they're not particular rigid, but at this level you just have to you have to settle on something. And if it later turns out there might be a third kind of perception, then so be it, kind of. I think that's how he says it. I have to do this kind of dichotomy to get going in any case of doing philosophy, right? That you have to do something. You can't just say, perceptions, I've done philosophy, right? So you have to start somewhere and build from that, right? And I find this to be perfectly fine with me. Now, I wouldn't do it this way, personally. But that's just my choice, right? This is his philosophy. This is Hume's philosophy. That's why I call it Hume's ontology. I don't call it ontology. I call it Hume's ontology, right? I would personally probably be able to use, I would maybe use synonyms for instance, impressions, or a synonym for idea, but it might be the same thing. It's actually, to a large extent at least, be referencing in my philosophy. It's more like the structure of how he does it that I would do differently, right? I wouldn't reject like sensations or passions or emotions or impressions or ideas, right? I wouldn't reject that, but I might put them together in a different fashion. That would make more sense to me in my ontology, right? Okay, so far so good. Then there's some discussion about how they are connected and what their cause, the causes between them and so on, right? And this is the blue area down here is sort of a further clarification of various aspects of the impressions and ideas and how they interact, sort of, right? Okay, so he says the causes are that impressions, them being simple or complex, and I might need to add a few words to simple or complex, always cause an identical idea. Impressions always cause identical ideas. If you have an impression, you will have an idea. And they will be identical except for the vivacity. There's a relation the other way, that an idea always relates to an identical impression. You can have that, if you have an idea, you will be able to have that impression. Even if you haven't had the impression yet, but you will be able to if you can have the idea of a blue parrot, you would be able to have the impression of a blue parrot. So the idea expands in some fashion on the impressions, so that if you have had the first impression of a bird, the next impression, you will be able to have further kinds of qualities of that particular type of idea as an impression. In other words, if you have experienced a bird that is brown, you will also now be able to experience a blue bird. Because there are various aspects. There are different kinds of sensations. There are different kinds of passion. Let's say sensations like their colors and sounds and taste and shapes and so on, right? That comes together in the idea. But that doesn't mean that just because the first idea or the first time you created that idea and the impression was brown, that the idea can only be ignited if the quality of the color is brown. You still have the idea, but if it's red, that idea can very well be ignited, so you experience a blue bird, for instance, right? Okay, so this is sort of my interpretation to some extent, right? Okay, so abstract ideas is imagined complex ideas can be formed of simple ideas which do not have a prior corresponding impression. So if you take an idea of, and this might be me going a bit out of a limb and over-interpreting Hume, but and maybe I want to combine it a bit with my own philosophy, maybe. So it's up to your scrutinizing whether I'm sort of going a bit too far here. But it's sort of dealing with the simple and the complex, right? The simple ideas always have a simple impression, and the complex impression always have a complex idea. But you can, out of the simple ideas, you can create complex ideas imagined that you haven't experienced that yet. Like if you say a 14-legged polar bear, right? You can imagine a 5-legged or 7-legged polar bear, right? That is blue and smells of oranges, right? You can do that in your mind without having the impression of it first. And the point is, it's not only the qualities of the sensation, the scope of the sensation, whether it's blue, red, or green, or that's not the complexity of the idea. It's the composition of ideas into a complex whole of separate simple ideas, where you take the idea of leg and add a new leg and a new leg, so you get a 14-legged polar bear. Your mind can screw around with these sort of simple ideas and create a complex idea that you have never experienced, right? You never had the impression of. And there could be various reasons why that is possible. First of all, it might be necessary to be able to imagine that in order to get to new ideas, to new complex ideas, right? If you couldn't imagine a complex idea, you might not be able to. If you were to experience a 16-legged polar bear, you wouldn't be able to have the idea of it if you couldn't imagine the idea of it, right? So you are expanding of your vocabulary of ideas by being able to combine simple ideas into complex ideas. So you're ready when those complex ideas might appear to you, so to say, right? So you can have the idea of it. So maybe I'm fabulating. Maybe this is sort of maybe I'm begging the question here. I'm not completely sure about this when I'm philosophizing in the wrong direction, maybe, right? Okay. So there is sort of a minimum base of a simple idea, and if the minimum base of a simple idea is that the simple idea always corresponds to an impression. There has to be an impression in order for that to be a simple idea. But you, as I said, you can create complex ideas based on simple ideas, a collection of simple ideas, and create something that you haven't had an impression of, right? Okay. So this is sort of how I see what Hume has been doing so far, and it sort of rounds it up nicely, I would say. There might be some very smaller aspects here and there that I haven't got completely right, but I think on the whole, this is sort of a functional representation of Hume so far, right? Okay, please share, like, and subscribe. See you in the next one.